For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Jeremiah 29:11. This is one of the most well-known, most loved verses in the entire Bible. We inscribe it, we share it, we quote it. It's a promise that seems to have been a lifeline for hundreds of people over the ages. Yet, we will never fully appreciate this verse unless we know something about its context and background. I think we all know that it was written to the Jewish exiles in Babylon who had been forcibly removed from Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar. And so the Jews now live hundreds of miles away from home with all their dreams and hopes shattered. Deep inside, they must wonder, how could God have let this happen to us? If we are truly His people, how did we end up here? And they wondered if God had forgotten them. In all their confusion and despair, it seems to me that they made two very human mistakes. Firstly, they thought they would never end up in Babylon, and that led them to false confidence. Secondly, they thought they would never get out of Babylon, and that led them to despair. And you and I today face the same danger when we, two things. One, expect what God has never promised. Yes, we can make the mistake of expecting what God has never promised and live out our weeks and months and years blaming God for not doing something that He never promised. Secondly, we refuse to believe what He has promised. Yes, we refuse to believe what He actually has promised. We have this supermarket mentality. We pick and choose what we want from the Bible. As we think about this popular verse, let's keep two things in mind. One, God will not always do what we expect Him to do. Two, He will always do what He says He will do. So I want to quickly say three things about this famous verse, Jeremiah 29:11. It begins, I know the thoughts that I think toward you. I know the thoughts that I think toward you. God thinks about you. In fact, God is thinking about us all the time. And that may be the most important statement you will ever hear. The God of the universe thinks about us. He considers us. He knows us. He remembers us. He keeps us in mind. He knows who we are and where we are. Not for 1 second are we ever lost or forgotten by Him. We don't always think about each other. We routinely get preoccupied with life, and we forget the people closest to us. We forget birthdays, we forget anniversaries, we forget special days. The truth is, most of us are better at remembering bad things. Yes, bad things. We can recall the hard times and the insults of others against us, even things that happened long ago. And even when we do have good thoughts about each other, we tend to forget after a while. Have you noticed that? That's why the famous English expression, out of sight, out of mind. But God never forgets his children. The word thoughts or thinking occurs 3 times in this small verse, Jeremiah 29:11. The Jews really needed to know this because they were far from home. And God has just said, verse 10, you'll be returning home, but not for 70 years, 70 years. Which was good news and bad news. Good because it meant they wouldn't be in Babylon forever, but bad because 70 years is a long time to be in exile. So what's God actually saying here? God is actually saying, you think I've forgotten about you? You know that you are here because you forgot me. And it's true that I'm punishing you for your disobedience. But my punishment does not diminish my affection for you, my love for you. You are forever in my thoughts. You are still my people. I have not forgotten you. We often think so much of life makes no sense. The good and the bad, the happy and the sad, it all gets jumbled up together with apparently no rhyme or reason. But God, says here, has a plan, even if it's not clear to us today. God knows what He is thinking about us, even when His thoughts are hidden from us. He has us constantly on His mind. There is nobody else who does that about us. God is thinking about us always. So God thinks about us. Secondly, God's thoughts toward us are good. What does the verse say? Thoughts of peace and not of evil. It's not enough to know that God is thinking of us, but we need to know what He is thinking about us. And He makes it clear here. Thoughts of peace and not of evil. I'm looking at some other translations, and this is what I get. The ESV says, plans for welfare and not for evil. The Message says, plans to take care of you, not abandon you. The New Living Translation says, plans for good and not for disaster. We will never properly understand Jeremiah 29:11 if we think it is a kind of a divine magic wand to protect us from pain or keep us from suffering. Remember that this verse of hope, this oft quoted verse, was given to the Jews while they faced suffering and hardship in Babylon. They were not in Jerusalem. They were away from their beloved temple. They were far away. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? We can't. This verse would provide great encouragement to the Jews at this time. What is God saying? He's saying, I sent you to Babylon. I am thinking about you while you are in Babylon. I have not forgotten you in Babylon. I am with you in Babylon. I will give you a future in Babylon. I will bring you home from Babylon. This verse of hope comes to people in despair in Babylon. Mostly it's God's way of saying, I still love you, even though you have blown it badly. And I still have got great plans for you, starting now in Babylon. I don't know if I'm digressing, but what is God trying to do when he allows his children to go through hard trials and deep suffering? Some of us testified about trials we've just gone through, suffering. Some of us asked for prayer requests for others who are suffering. And we ourselves, some of us right now listening, may be suffering. There are several answers to that question. I'll mention 5 that means something to me. First, God is trying to purge us of sin and to purify us of iniquity. You can't get away from that. We are sinners. We'd like to think we are very smart, wonderful people. No, we're just sinners. And God, through suffering, purges us of sin, purifies us of iniquity. Secondly, God uses suffering to test our faith. Will you still obey God in the darkness? Will you hold on to the truth when you feel like giving up? It's a test. It's a test God knows that you can win with his help. Thirdly, God uses times of difficulty to humble us. Humble us. One of the greatest things in the world, humility. The world thinks nothing of it, but for God it is number one, humility. When things are going well, we tend to get puffed up about our accomplishments. But let the darkness fall and we are on our knees crying out to God. Humility. Seek humility. Fourth, God uses hard times to prepare us to minister to others. I know many Christians whose greatest ministry has come from sharing with others how God helped them through a time of crisis, through a time of pain and suffering. And fifthly and lastly, God uses hard times to prepare us for a new understanding of his own character. The character of God is so vast. A to Z is not enough to fill it. There's so much to learn about his character. In the furnace, we discover God's goodness in a way we had never experienced before. People who testified earlier will testify to that. Thirdly, God intends to give us a future filled with hope. To give you a future and a hope, the verse says. Some versions say to give you an expected end. That's actually a good way to translate the Hebrew. God is not just giving us a vague promise. No, this verse has a very specific focus. God has an appointed end for his people, and nothing will hinder them from reaching that appointed end. Let's look to that end, like Paul says, forgetting the things that are behind and looking forward to that glorious end that God has for us. Though they could not see it, held as they were under total Babylonian domination, 70 years down the road, the same God who raised up a pagan king, Nebuchadnezzar, to judge them, will now raise up another pagan king, King Cyrus, to deliver them. And neither pagan king, Nebuchadnezzar or Cyrus, was aware of his part in God's plan. Each man acted according to his own free will. And God worked through those kingly decisions to bring his children home. How amazing is that? They will see the end that God always intended. God has no unfinished plans. So, three things. And seen in this light, Jeremiah 29:11 becomes a great comfort, especially when we are going through hard times. He teaches us three things: that God thinks of us at all times, that his thoughts towards us are good, and then when his purposes have been completed, he will bring our troubles to their appointed end. What Ashish Rajwadi spoke about last week, being patient, waiting patiently, like the psalmist, I waited patiently. That's what you and I, as Christians, are called to do, even through times of waiting, times of suffering, times of pain. Allow me to use an illustration. A well-known pastor talks about his first job as a young man, many in the last century, many years ago. He worked in a factory that made Coca-Cola bottles, Coke bottles. And I'm reading from his diary. I was surrounded by the roar of the enormous machines as the molten glass was pressed into a series of molds. As soon as the mold opened, the newly formed Coke bottles lined up like soldiers in a line, row after row after row, thousands of bottles every hour carried away on a slow-moving conveyor belt. The manager every day used to give me a warning: never touch the new bottles. Don't ever, whatever you do, touch those bottles. For two reasons. One, the glass was far too hot. And secondly, because they would easily shatter. The pastor says, the first part I could understand, but the shattering part made no sense to me. Coke bottles were made to withstand enormous abuse. They were used and reused several times. They were so tough. So how could the bottle shatter so easily right on the assembly line? The manager patiently explained to me that the glass had to be cured, yes, by heating it to a very high temperature. After allowing them to cool for a few minutes, they had to be passed through a vast oven that cured the glass, a hot oven that cured the glass. And if we don't heat the bottles, the manager said, they will all shatter, he said. The curing process actually made the glass stronger and was absolutely necessary to produce a Coke bottle that could be used and reused and reused and reused and be able to withstand heat and cold without shattering. Remember the old days when we used to keep Coke bottles in the fridge? Became ice. The curing of the Coke bottle was necessary and beneficial for its ultimate purpose. And it's the same for you and for me. We cannot, you and I cannot in our lives skip the furnace times of life. They are part of God's purpose to make us ultimately useful to Him and to others. That may not feel very comfortable when you feel the heat blasting around you, but you will not be in the furnace a second longer than is necessary. When your trial has come to its appointed end, appointed by God Himself, you will come forth stronger, much stronger than before. And as Christians, we suffer as others suffer. We get sick, we face trouble, we go through the full range of human experiences like the rest of the world. We're not spared that. And there is no Bible verse, there's no verse that you will ever find in the Bible that can take away the pain of this world. No. But Jeremiah 29:11 is given to help us while we are in the furnace with the certain truth that we are there for a purpose, that it won't last forever, and that God will be glorified and we will be improved by our furnace time. And if we know Jesus, if we truly know Jesus, not the namesake Jesus, but the real Jesus, we will have what we need when we need it, even in the furnace. If you needed to be somewhere else right now, you would be in that other place. But you are where you are right now because of God's providential oversight of your life. So accept it. We either believe this or we don't. If we don't, we are bound to end up unhappy, frustrated, miserable, filled with doubts, given to anger, and prone to seeking quick fixes instead of waiting on the Lord, instead of waiting on the Lord patiently. But if we do believe it, then we will wait patiently on the Lord, believing that right now, Babylon is better for us than Jerusalem, even as we wait for the day when we will finally go home. Many of us know and cling to Jeremiah 29:11 by itself, but rightly understood, it takes on a deeper, more relevant, and even more powerful meaning for our lives. You know, in the previous chapter, chapter 28, Jeremiah has just pronounced judgment, you remember, upon the false prophet Hananiah. What about Hananiah? Hananiah had just told the people that God would free them from exile, that rescue is coming, and they would return home in 2 years, just 2 years. That was a lie, and it did not come from God. And it resulted in God removing Hananiah from the face of the earth. Instead, God's prophet Jeremiah tells the people they would live in Babylon for at least 70 years. Therefore, what should they do? They should wait patiently, and while they wait patiently, they should settle down, they should build houses, they should marry, and even pray for the peace and prosperity of the city in which they found themselves. Because in blessing Babylon, they in turn would be blessed, and God's appointed end would come. So when understood in context, we discover that the words of Jeremiah 29:11 were spoken to people in the midst of hardship and suffering, people who probably desire an immediate rescue like the one Hananiah lied about. But God's response is not to provide immediate escape from the difficult situation. Rather, God promises that He has a plan to prosper them in the midst of their current painful, difficult situation. You and I, facing difficult situations today, can take great comfort in Jeremiah 29:11, knowing that it is not a promise to immediately rescue us from hardship or suffering, but rather a promise that God has a plan for our lives. And regardless of our current situation, He can work through it to prosper us and give us a hope and a future. Remember, God has never had any unfinished plans. All His plans are realized, but in His time. In the following two verses, after verse 11, God affirms this and he tells us, gives us this promise. When you call on me and come and pray to me, I will listen to you. You will seek me and you will find me when you seek me with all your heart. May God truly bless us all through Jeremiah 29:11. Amen.